Hello and welcome to the very first and maybe last episode of Dani Talks About Things, my own personal podcast. For those of you who don't know, my name is Dani Park. I am from Los Angeles, specifically South Bay area. I have a bachelor's in an undergraduate in journalism with a master's in philosophy. Don't even ask me how much I owe in student loans right now. And currently I am a Stevenson Center Fellow in the field of sociology with the wonderful Natasha Moody, who I absolutely love and adore. And so, when sort of asked to talk about this podcast and the things that I'm going to be discussing in it, one of the things that sort of came up for me is, why did I join the Peace Corps? Why did I decide to commit 2+ years of my life going abroad, going to a location that I didn't really even know much about, and deciding to do that? And, you could say that part of it was me being crazy and filled with a certain sense of wanderlust, as I'm sure a lot of us who are young oftentimes have. But if I am going to be sort of honest, it was none of the above. It wasn't wanderlust. It wasn't this desire to go out and see the world, but really to escape. That essentially was it. As I said before, I have a master's already in philosophy, and while I was sort of going through that program, I became disillusioned. And disillusionment oftentimes breeds a very, very large sense of displacement. I just didn't feel like I belonged in that department. Not because of anybody there. I want to make that very clear. The professors there and the students there were absolutely wonderful, but it was a very large disconnect between what I thought philosophy was and what I believed philosophy to be. The program itself sort of pushed me in this direction of sort of analytical thinking, which is what American philosophy essentially is, but I wasn't concerned with a lot of the topics that they wanted to discuss. I wasn't concerned with concepts of language. I was concerned about the bigger picture. I was concerned about issues that mattered to me, such as morality, such as life, such as, the critical thinking necessary to understand why inequality exists. All of these ideas weren't being tackled in the way that I thought they would be in philosophy. And so while I love thinking, I love critical thinking, I love just, writing, and I love reading other people's works, I became disillusioned. And that was really what propelled me to join the Peace Corps in the first place. During my Peace Corps experience, I was, placed in Costa Rica, which I only found out later was the second most popular Peace Corps program, right after Peace Corps Fiji, which I think Lindsay was fortunate enough to do, and you can kind of tell why. I loved my experiences when I was doing my PST, my pre-service training, which lasts for 3 months, and I was quite literally thrown into a situation where I didn't really know the language or the culture, and it was really sort of a sink or swim for me. But I was placed in San Isidro, which was this is absolutely beautiful, quaint little town on the outskirts of Heredia, which is like the main city in the province of Heredia. And I just absolutely loved it. I loved my host family. I still talk with them. They came to see me as a family, and I came to see them as a family. There was just so many things that I could talk about my Peace Corps career. That in and of itself could be its own podcast. But one of the looking back on it, and I have the gift of hindsight now, the most rewarding thing about Peace Corps are the relationships that you forge. And for me, for the purposes of this discussion, I was evacuated because of the COVID pandemic that was at that time just starting to become a global issue. And I was evacuated, and the evacuation was, at first, I thought that the evacuation would be gradual. We would have a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but we would at least have a little bit of time to say goodbye to those whom we loved, and those people who we really just considered to be friends and family for the past 2 years of our lives. And what had happened is that there was a state of emergency declared by the president of Costa Rica, and all foreigners, essentially, or those who did not have long-term residency status, had to leave. They had to evacuate. And so at that time, what was compounded by the problems were compounding in that the head of the Peace Corps, the director of the Peace Corps, also around that time concurrently issued a statement saying all Peace Corps volunteers are to return. And, what originally was going to be, I think, a week or maybe a week or two, was condensed essentially into one weekend. And so I didn't even have time to say goodbye to my students. I didn't have time to say goodbye to all my counterparts. I didn't even really have time to say goodbye to all my host family. And so it was just a very, very bittersweet moment. And it was at that point when I sort of realized how much for granted I took of all of the relationships that I forged with all of these people, and these people who I naively thought, okay, I'm going to do the Peace Corps. After 2 years, I'm going to get out of there. But you can't, because you do leave a part of yourself behind. And, that's also the reason why to this day, I still think that there's a part of me that I left behind in Costa Rica. And it's tremendously rewarding. I still talk to people. I still, many of my students added me on Facebook. So I see their progress in life and things like that. And they're growing older. They're growing up. I feel like in a very strange way, I feel like kind of like a dad almost. Because I came to see a lot of these students as like, these little rascals. But, kids that I kind of grew up to love, really, as somebody who knows that deep down inside these kids, although they're rambunctious, although they're loud, and although more often than not, I almost always ended school with like a sore throat because of my voice was gone. They were deep down inside, they're still wonderful kids. And so that was really one of those aspects or moments that I really just came to love about my experiences in the Peace Corps. What happened actually as a result of being evacuated is that we didn't go through the traditional Peace Corps exit, if you will. I don't think this is a particular tradition that is endemic to all Peace Corps programs around the world, but maybe I think it was just in Peace Corps Costa Rica, but we had a quote-unquote gonging out, in which the country director would bring out this gong, and we would sort of discuss within our own groups sort of the things that we are proud of, the things that we struggled with, and we would gong out. And with the tapping of the gong, we would essentially say, all right, this part of my life, although it was rewarding, although it was taxing, we can officially sort of move on. And with the sounding of the gong, we can at least admit to ourselves that our Peace Corps journey is at an end. And obviously we didn't have the traditional gonging out ceremony because of the fact that all different Peace Corps groups that were coming in, we were all sort of packed together in this hotel room, sort of haphazardly, because we were all called to the Capitol at once, and we were essentially told, okay, you guys are basically all going to leave together. We're still, I felt really bad for our program manager and director, because, you can see him in the back. He had on, I think, I saw it too, he had his laptop and he had on at least 6 different, travel tabs for like Travelocity, Expedia, and all these types of stuff. He was just trying to get us out of there. And all the tickets were booked. Every single, all the people, everybody, all tourists were essentially forced to leave the country because of the president's mandate. And so, we were, it was just really hectic on their end. It was hectic and tragic on our end because we had to say goodbye to the people that we really just loved. And, it felt cruel in a way, just being completely honest. It felt really, really cruel because, in my heart, I was one of those people who knew deep down inside that I would come to enjoy my Peace Corps service, but when the 2 years were up, they were up, and I would go on and do other things. But, just going up there and talking, I cracked a lot of jokes, admittedly, because I thought that it was really important for us to laugh. But, deep down inside, laughing was the last thing I wanted to do. There was just a lot of tears, a lot of hugging, a lot of, if we're just going to be sort of honest, a lot of false promises about how we're going to, come back and stuff like that, how we're going to see each other and stuff. But deep down inside, I think we all knew that this was unprecedented. This is a pandemic and something that hasn't happened in a century. And so we were just, I think at the time, and I think some of us even today, are sort of hit with this, I can't believe it. This moment of sheer just insanity, this moment in which none of us wanted, none of us desired, but was forced upon us. And this sort of reminds us back to PST, when all of us are sort of told, you got to be adaptable. You got to be flexible. That's the only way you're going to last the 2 years. And here all of us were really masters of flexibility and adapting. And we were forced to be flexible and adapt to probably the biggest and cruelest moment of them all, which is leaving our sites without saying goodbyes, being wrenched apart essentially from the communities which we felt we were a part of. And so, the period immediately after, as I'm sure a lot of people know, it was a period of just great uncertainty. There was massive layoffs as businesses were shuttering and closing. I was fortunate enough to be accepted into ISU right before this pandemic hit. I think I got the acceptance letter, I believe in December or January, I'm not too sure. But I was, no. If anything, I think I got it a little bit later, I think in March. But, for the entire time between mid-March when we were evacuated, and August when my program at ISU began, it was just sort of a gray area. And so at first couple of weeks, it honestly was just, it took a lot of adjusting to be back home. Back home, I live in the desert, and so, my family lives in the desert, and I stayed with them, and so it was just really, really cold. I didn't even bring back jackets or anything like that, so I was just absolutely shivering. Fortunately, my parents didn't throw away any of my clothes, but bad news is these were clothes back from 6th, 7th grade, and so I was just putting on a jacket that was way too tight. Thank God no one had a camera at the moment. Otherwise, that would be such good material for blackmail. But yeah, it was just a period of really just, what am I doing? What am I supposed to be doing? And so I was one of those people, I was like, I'm not going to let this happen to me. I am going to make something of myself. So I started learning music. I started learning how to compose music and stuff like that. I I brushed up on all my philosophy, including past essays and things I wanted to study when I was at ISU, and so by the time I did start my program at ISU, I considered myself to be ready. And I think that was in part due to the Peace Corps, where it's just it's, this is what I liken it back to what Eisenhower said, which is, in my experience, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And that's essentially what I did for the period immediately after. And, that's ultimately what I kind of decided when I was going to join the Stevenson Center. And lastly, talking about the Stevenson Center, I loved the Stevenson Center's mission. I loved the mission of, communities, more importantly, a deeper analysis and examination of why it is communities are suffering, why there's inequalities within communities, how we as individual agents can go in and help as opposed to merely discuss it. And this was, I think, the very important gap, the bridging that initially led to my disillusionment, right, between pure theory and theory with application. Practicality and theory sort of going hand in hand. And so that's one of the reasons, actually that is the main reason why I decided to go into the Stevenson Center. And so when Beverly, the previous program director, when she called me and she said, do you want to do this? I think I actually made her temporarily deaf by my screaming. But I was just absolutely, I tried to hold my composure, I tried to be professional. But how can you be professional when you get accepted into a program like this? And so I was just super happy. And really, looking back on hindsight, I think one of the things that I was proud of really sincerely proud of is my growth, my own personal intellectual growth. Um, and in doing so, I think that one of the things that I'm doing in a very, nostalgic and very romantic way is I'm sort of continuing what I left off at Costa Rica, which is I'm continuing to impact communities. I'm continuing to do the best. I'm forging new relations in my environment, which isn't, Costa Rica, unfortunately, but it is the continuing of the legacy of Costa Rica. I think that I was unfortunately wrenched away from my community too soon, but in being transplanted to another way, I feel like I'm doing the work and finishing the work essentially that I did in Costa Rica.